Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute at 57 Post Street in San Francisco. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and we're very pleased to welcome you for the first of our Rising Writers series, co-curated by Theodore Gioia. Before we begin, I'd like to mention, if you are new to the Institute, please come back on Wednesday at noon and take the free tour of our library, which is on the second and third floors. We have the International Chess Club, which is right down the hallway. And you'll get an introduction to our various programs, which include author events like this one. We have a Cinema-Lit film series every Friday night. The library hosts a variety of book clubs and also writers programs. And of course, the Chess Club has ongoing chess classes and tournaments. So we hope that you'll come back, take a tour, become a member, and become part of our ever-growing and vital cultural family here at the Mechanics Institute. So it is my pleasure, of course, to introduce and welcome Ingrid Rojas Contreras and Elaine Castillo, who will be in conversation with Carolina de Robertis. But first, I'd like to introduce our co-curator, Theodore Gioia. Ted is a critic living in San Francisco, and his work has appeared in The Believer, The American Scholar, Los Angeles Review of Books, It's That Nice, and the Virginia Quarterly Review.
The mic just went out.
He's currently, are we still on?
No, the mic just seemed to.
Okay, are we on? Are we on? Okay, continuing the bio. Ted is currently writing a book of essays about the evolution of California culture framed through food and art. Oh, two good combinations. Ted is also the former partnerships director of McSweeney's and a curator of the Rising Writers series here at the Mechanics Institute, as I just mentioned. And he is also the founder of the upcoming site Fork Tongue, interviewing food critics on the future of food writing. All right, well, that's a delicious introduction, so welcome, Ted Gioia.
Can you all hear me without using the mic? Oh, we're recording, okay. Hello, welcome to the first reading in the Rising Writers series at the Mechanics Institute. It's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. My name's Ted Gioia. I'm a critic in San Francisco and the curator of the series. The seed for this series began when I first came to San Francisco, and a friend of mine told me that young writers don't live in the Bay Area anymore. That seemed to be the popular opinion. And I came to Laura with the idea for this series because I was dissatisfied with this conventional wisdom and dissatisfied with the way that so many people seem to talk about the Bay Area literary landscape today. So much talk is focused on the past. When people think of San Francisco fiction, they think of the 1950s and the Beats and 2000s and Dave Eggers, or some New Yorker vacationing in Palo Alto for a month and writing their caricature novel of Silicon Valley. But nothing about what it actually means to be a writer today, to be a young writer today on the ground in the Bay Area, not 1955, not 2002, but right now in 2019. Because right now is actually a compelling, exhilarating literary moment. We've just seen a boom of great first novels by diverse authors in our very own backyard. But it's a moment that goes under-discussed too often. And we hope this series can be a forum to explore this question by offering a stage for emerging authors to have that real talk about the issues, anxieties, and inspirations that matter to young writers in California today. One of the problems is California literature defies easy classification. There's no Philip Roth of San Francisco or John Updike of Oakland whose voice defines the area's zeitgeist. There's no one voice, there are many voices. And that's why we're here tonight. Because in a strange way, perhaps there's no better representation of the California novelist in 2019, the future of the California novelist, than Our two speakers this evening, Elaine Castillo and Ingrid Rojas Contreras. Last year, both published their first novel to critical acclaim. Elaine's novel, America Is Not the Heart, was named one of the best books of 2018 by NPR, Kirkus Reviews, the San Francisco Chronicle, and many more, and also is probably one of the best opening paragraphs I've read in years. Ingrid's novel, Fruit of the Drunken Tree, is a national bestseller, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice, and garnered that most elusive accolade, an interview with Seth Meyers. The conversation will be moderated by the incomparable Carolina de Robertis, the author of three novels, The Gods of Tango, Perla, and the editor of the collection Radical Hope, Letters of Love and Dissent in a Dangerous Time. She's a celebrated translator and one of the Bay Area's most prominent critics and cultural instigators. Named in 2017 by the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts as one of the top 100 people that are shaping the future of culture. So it's my great pleasure to hand the stage over to Carolina and I'll get out of the way and let you guys talk.
Thank you so much, Ted. Thank you, Ted, for that incredibly kind and generous introduction. Thank you so much, Ingrid and Elaine, for being here with me. I can't wait. I'm so excited about this conversation, and I think you both know this already, but I feel extremely passionate about both of these books, and it's been so exciting to swim through them and think about them and have exciting conversations about them, and now we can bring it here to this stage and to all of these people. Every single one of you, thank you so much for coming out here tonight and joining us for this exchange and dialogue and conversation where we can really chop it up and riff about all things writing, literature, and Bay Area culture and beyond. Thank you also to the Mechanics Institute for hosting this. There will be time for questions from the audience later in this program, so feel free to start percolating. I notice when that gets said, then people actually percolate and come with those questions. So bring them, let them rise to the top. So, Elaine and Ingrid, I wonder if we could maybe begin in a place that is maybe a common place to begin in conversations about novels, but certainly something people want to know about, which is like the seed, the beginning, the burning thing that brought you to this book. And I'll maybe frame the question a little more broadly by thinking about one of the things that's meaningful to me as a novelist that I always return to is the great Toni Morrison saying that novels are inquiries, but they begin with an urgent question, something that we want to explore, perhaps not answer, but at least dive through and explore. If that resonates for you, what burning questions started this journey and how did it evolve for you? And you can maybe take turns talking about that.
I mean, I think for me initially, well, it started with inquiry in that it started with failure in that I had written a completely different book and shelved it. I always say for the good of all humanity. And after that, I think started writing what became the prologue. So what is still the prologue. So the first words I wrote of the book are still the prologue of the book. But at that point, I thought it was going to be a completely different book. I thought it was a book that was going to be really mainly set in the kind of 90s Bay Area, told from the perspective of, you know, either the woman who tells the perspective of the prologue or a different character. And all of those pages that I wrote were just dead in the water, had no voice to them, had no sort of life in them. And I think it was only, talking about seeds, it was only thinking about a seed for an idea, about a story that I'd had, I think, years and years ago, sort of maybe when I was in college, that came from stories that my dad had told about a cousin who was in the New People's Army, which is the armed wing of the Communist Party in the Philippines. A cousin I'd never met and still haven't met, so don't know anything about her. The character in the book is not based on her. But these sort of stories of, you know, hiding her when the Philippine army was looking for her. So I think I was just talking to someone about that and thinking, more to your point about the question, I think the question might have been sort of, if I had known, if I followed that sort of tantalizing thread or that seed, who would that person be? Or what would that story be? So I think that initially is how the sort of book came alive then.
It's exciting. Thank you.
I was thinking, I was a new immigrant to this country, and I think I was thinking about how to be as a person. I didn't understand how all the stories that had happened to me before coming, how they could fit into my life here. And I think I started to have this experience of going through my days and going through my life, and then having those days of trying to understand my surroundings, being interrupted by these flashbacks of either just traumatic moments or moments of leaving, or these very intense sensory moments of what living in Colombia was like. And I think it started to happen the same with the writing, where maybe I sat down and I was intending to not write a story about Colombia. And I wanted, I think I wanted to write something that wasn't that, because it was so much of my lived experience. But it started to happen in the same way, where what I was trying to write would get interrupted by these flashbacks. And I think the novel was born in that way, that I was resisting it consistently for many years, and it just kept kind of coming and coming and coming until I said, fine, I will write the story.
Yeah, so that it just kind of, that's the burning, right? The burning part of the burning question, like it keeps coming back, it keeps wanting to be there. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because it makes you think about a strand that feels like it connects your books, and a lot of immigrant fiction either by or about immigrant characters, by immigrants or about immigrant characters, or both, is that in both books there's very much this feeling, the relationship to setting is so vast and sweeping, even when the character's in one place. Like Hieronima is in the United States, she's in California for a lot of this time, but through memory we go back to the Philippines, right, into these like the intrusive memories of her experience with the New People's Army. And then in your book as well, Ingrid, we have an immigrant, and then we open in the United States, but then there's this long, and this is the journey in Colombia for you to really understand what it is for her to be here today, right? So there's this feeling that the characters carry multiple countries inside their skin, right? There's multiple countries inside one character. How was that for you to create, to portray, to bring sort of like multiple settings into one narrative thread?
I mean, I think to some extent it has to be natural, because it's also the kind of context that you grow up in. I mean, certainly that's true for me. I think it's not remarkable to me, because that's my normal, I think, right. in that sense. To grow up with parents who, each spoke their own language, and then spoke another Filipino language to each other, and then have that mixed with English, that all of that would sort of exist on the same plane, and not be sort of remarkable in any way. And that was, that's an American reality. And I think it's more to the point that we have to sort of expand our notion of what sort of American fiction looks like, what cities are in American fiction, that they might not always be American cities, because that's not true of all Americans or the people who are living here, that we just sort of live sort of unilaterally in this space. And also I think, so much of when we write about setting, I think what's difficult about writing about setting is that oftentimes, especially in diaspora, there are often sort of really breaks that happen, and then people never go back.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, certainly, I experienced that with my family, that there were some members, like I knew there were members sort of in the community who I often knew were middle class or upper middle class, people who could go back to the Philippines regularly. But that was just not a reality for my family, for a lot of people I knew. It was sort of like, I mean, I think my mom maybe went back to the Philippines twice in my lifetime until recently, where she started going back more. So that sense of a country being completely inside of you, but also completely broken away from you, and having to toggle what that means, is this something that I've like completely sort of cut out of my life, but obviously you haven't. So sort of, I think living in that kind of ultimately hauntedness is how those sort of stories sort of surge out, I think, of people, and then ultimately of fiction too.
Yeah, and you really portray it on a very intimate level. I mean, even on the linguistic level, because your book really is quadrilingual. I mean, you have English, people are speaking Tagalog, people are speaking Ilocano, Pangasinan, right? And you have all these languages.
Very good accent there.
Thank you. Well, I mean, and these languages, like exist and sing and speak within the book, and that is reflective of these people's lives. This California story. right? And you also write very intimately. I appreciate the intimacy with like what it is to switch between languages, to be outside of a language that is actually from your country, and people in your family, and the different, you know, the intimacy that is a relationship to language. Right.
Yeah, well, because, I mean, it's often sort of, I think people often think, well, all of these non-English languages are foreign only to us sort of white readers or whatever.
Yeah.
But a lot of the languages are also foreign to like diasporic Filipino kids. Like a lot of like Filipinx kids don't necessarily speak Tagalog fluently. I don't. I understand quite a lot of it. And I think if you got me drunk, I would start to speak more of it. But
It happens to me with Spanish.
exactly, the kind of inhibitions go away, and then suddenly, oh yeah, I'm fluent.
I just quit after a couple of hard drinks. I just quit English. Something happens, but English is like nope.
Oh
it's
yeah,
just gone.
Yeah, even to people who.
But anyway, please go on.
No, but it's and it's true. So I think for me, it's important to put all of those languages in there, also untranslated with gaps, because that's just how that community sounds.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, even on a craft level, I think that makes me think. You know, what I say with students at San Francisco State, right, is that our formal decisions, like both books are formally innovative in ways that I hope we can touch on, but the formal decisions we make about structure, technique, even style, are at their most powerful when form mirrors content, right? And so, you know, the formal experience of hearing Ilocano from the characters' mouths and not knowing what it means, that actually reflects the experiences of some of the people in the book, right, who are not on the inside of those languages, even though they're also Filipino. Yeah.
I mean, it's very rarely sort of described as a formal choice.
Yeah.
I think. But in a way, actually, this is going to go back to the question that I was going to ask you when we were talking about like writing and sort of. I often think like writers of color are very rarely asked about formal choices, or that use of language is very rarely sort of framed as an artistic choice.
Yes.
Like it's always sort of, well, I guess you know you want it to be exotic and you're really alienating me as a reader.
Yes.
And it's like no, that's ultimately part of the art that you're trying to create.
Yeah. You're making a formally innovative decision that is reflective of the character's inner lives and creating nuance and sophistication and an aesthetic experience. Yeah.
So you're at first, Carolina.
Ingrid?
I had a different experience. I think, you know, I was the first immigrant, so I didn't have parents that were living here, and I was just living here on my own.
Yeah.
And I was calling back home, and I think the language experience that I went through was very compartmentalized. So that with my family I spoke Spanish, and then here I spoke English. And I think that I was overjoyed whenever I could meet someone that spoke both. And I think that I got just very excited through just texting with them. But there's all these literary observations that I remember making. I think at some point I was texting someone like ha ha ha, but it was H-A-H-A, and then it just became J-A-J-A, which is how we spell it.
We write it, ha ha ha.
So
which is funny.
But I was trying to say, like, it was a laugh that started in English and then ended in Spanish.
Right.
And I think those kinds of spaces of being in language are so important. But I loved those. But I think for me, in my life, in my day-to-day, it was more just separate experiences. And then noticing how strange my Spanish was becoming to my parents, because I was more using English from day to day. And so they started calling me like, oh, but you're American now. And it was just that strain of just not using one language more, and what that does, and how it kind of becomes this third, like, bastard thing. So I think in my book I was interested in that too, in just how this maybe there's a possibility for both languages to kind of become one, or echo one another, or just make it ungrammatical a little bit, so that it can sound more like what I feel like it should sound, which is Spanish.
And then you also have two primary voices. The book is told in two voices. It goes back and forth between them, and these are two people with very different life experiences, right? Both living in Colombia and separated by class and other aspects of their life experience. And so I see you also making, back to formal choices around language, like saying tactical choices, right, in those voices, and how you kind of carry them forward. Can you talk about that, like how you brought those voices to life on a sentence level, because it's very deeply felt.
Thank you. So there's one character, Chula, who is she comes as a refugee to the U.S. And when I was writing her voice, I was just translating in my head. So I would hear her in Spanish, and then I would type it in English. So I was just directly translating her voice. And with Petrona, who's the other character, and she stays in Colombia, and she's not able to leave kind of like the traumatic situation that tears these two characters apart. Her chapters I had to actually write in Spanish because I couldn't. What was going on with her language was somehow I wasn't getting a handle on it enough that I could translate it immediately, and maybe they were too intense, and I needed to hear them in Spanish first, and then figure out how they would sound in English.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even on the formal level, thinking about the fact that Petrona is the one who doesn't get out, so she never actually comes to exist in English,
right?
Unlike
Exactly,
Chula,
yeah.
right? So in a way, it sort of makes sense that she would be created within the Spanish-only context of your writing space, inner writing space.
That does make sense now that you mention it. Thank you.
I'm just thinking about
that in future
like
interviews.
thinking about process, but that's the interesting thing too about creating a novel is that process isn't always conscious, right? Is that sometimes you make process decisions, and then later, when the book is already physically here and you're up on a stage in front of some lovely people, you can go, oh, maybe that is why I did that and what it allowed me to open. But we sort of follow our instincts sometimes. There's a balance, right, between I set out intentionally to use multiple points of view because I want this to be polyphonic, because I want it to portray a broad spectrum. And sometimes we don't know why. We just know that all of a sudden we're needing to write in another voice. So maybe you could speak to how that happened for you in terms of, were there parts of your process in finding the structure, the approach for making this book happen that were unconscious, or you're kind of feeling your way in the dark? Were there parts that you were intentional about from early on?
I mean, I definitely did not set out to write a polyphonic book. I wanted
You
to write
didn't?
a very uniphonic book. Only that voice, that fawn just didn't work out.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately what I probably discovered writing this book, I don't know if it's going to be the same for the next book, is that I have to write just a lot. Basically, I think I have to write the world, which is to say I have to write seemingly the background detail, like to the grandma detail of like the most minute side character, so that I know what that world is like, so I know who those people are.
Yes.
And then once I've written that world, then start finding the book that's in it. I hope that that's not always how I have to write, because it takes a while, and you do lose a lot. I mean, there's a lot of thank God I wasn't printing it out, but there would have been a lot of reams of paper being sort of recycled. But so I think that's one part of it, sort of feeling that that I had to go to the macro in order to find the micro. But I think also, sort of figuring out what voice or what perspective I was going to write the book from. Because initially I thought I was going to write the book from the perspective of a character that I autobiographically share a lot of detail with. So I thought I would be very close to this character, and sort of somewhat naively thought I would be able to write, capture that voice. I had no idea what she sounded like. I had no idea how to write from her perspective. And I think it was only when I started writing from the perspective of someone that I actually found really uncomfortable to write from, that I, from a class background-wise, had no interest in telling her story, didn't want to tell a story about someone who grew up in that type of privilege in the Philippines. But I think another thing that I discovered is that type of discomfort, that type of uneasiness is actually what gave me the kind of freedom to move around. And I don't know if that will always continue to be the case. I just have to figure out characters that I don't want to write about, and then apparently I'll bust out a novel from that. But that's how it worked for this one.
Yeah. Just maybe the assumption that writers really write from themselves or are really writing about themselves and characters, or that writers should write what they know, what they've experienced themselves, and kind of stay in their lane. Do you think that that assumption is stronger for writers of color?
Oh, for sure. Oh,
Yeah.
1000% for sure.
Yeah.
Why-
Didn't mean that to be a leading
Oh,
question.
yeah.
You can't,
Yeah.
but, you know,
I mean, there was really no other answer could have been that. But I mean, we know this, you know, sort of
Yeah.
like white middle-class writers who write about themselves. It's like, wow, groundbreaking, sort of mixing forms. It's like autofiction. It's a new genre. And it's like Maxine Hong Kingston has been mixing autobiography and fiction in ways, and
Yeah.
you know, it's just immigrant literature. You know, she's not given the kind of like formal or sort of accolades that, I mean, she is, but I mean, I don't think that the sort of long history of thinking about autobiography and fiction is sort of valorized in our sort of mainstream literary discourse when it comes to writers of color. Ultimately, probably because we don't value the autobiographies of writers of color, because when we think about sort of immigrant lives or immigrant narrative, that kind of genre, it's like, well, there's a way of thinking about that it's just sort of like, well, it's not art, you know. It's not art if you're talking about, you know, a community of Filipinos in the Bay Area. It's art of falling in love, or sort of recovering from trauma. It's art if they're all sort of middle class and in Brooklyn. Then we're really we're getting at the sort of universal condition. And I think it's that sort of that paucity of our discourse to imagine that people who are not white have universal sort of experiences, and also that we really need to dismantle the idea that the universal or the neutral is something that exists. Like, these are only categories that really exist to maintain, you know, a certain sort of community, as you know, those are the stories that we all have to consume, and you know, it's just not the case.
Yeah. And then there's a layer of queer narratives too, or queer-centered, right?
Sure.
Protagonists who have that in some aspect of their journey.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, the main character in the book is bi and falls in love with a woman in the book, and it was important for me to have a queer narrative that was also, I think, different from the queer narratives that I'd grown up growing up, because I'm also bi and wanted to see more bi women, and especially bi women of color in fiction. But a lot of those narratives were ultimately either, you know, white queer narratives, or in particular, I think, urban queer narratives. And I think there was a lack of, you know, there's a trajectory that it's like, if you come from the suburbs or from like rural provinces, you have to go to the city in order to be sort of fully actualized. And that narrative is also true in my life, so I don't have anything against that narrative, but I also know it's not the only queer narrative. It's certainly not the only queer narrative that I saw growing up in sort of queer people. And I think it was also interesting for me to think about that kind of intersection between, okay, maybe you're queer, but then you're also undocumented, and you are sort of dependent upon the benevolence of your family in order to survive. So you can't just go to San Francisco or like find yourself in San Francisco or in LA, because like you don't have papers. Like there are huge other, you know, sort of factors involved in sort of shaping what you're trying to build as a life. So I think thinking about those types of queer narratives was important for me.
But also bringing those layers together into a completely human, personal, intimate story, right?
And
That's
people
what
just fall in love.
makes
So.
it. Yeah. Ingrid, you could really enter in any of these many points that we've kind of brought to the
there's so
surface.
many.
Rather than repeat the questions, just say like, where do you want to jump into all of any of that?
Let's see. Wow, there was a lot said. I think when I was crafting this book, I was also thinking about stories that I wasn't hearing, and I think that there's in Colombia in particular, when the two classes, there's like even between like low middle class and just below poverty level families. The experience is so vastly different. Whereas people in Bogotá who are low middle class will say that the city is safe and that there's no violence going on. And they will say things like, come to Bogotá and visit, like we'll show you a great time, like it's safe here. And then someone who has maybe been displaced and lives in these settlements in Bogotá will actually see their families murdered either by the police, by the government police, or by kind of guerrilla members or paramilitary. And there's a lot of violence that they experience. And I wasn't hearing that. I wasn't hearing that story at all. And the other story that I wasn't hearing is, we in the U.S. we pay so much attention to the immigrant story, like the person who came and where did they come from and what happened. And I was also interested in the story of someone who actually couldn't leave. And what was it that made it impossible for them to leave? So I was also interested in looking at those structures in place, so that we, essentially, people who can become an immigrant have a combination of luck and privilege, and people who are not able to leave, what are those obstacles in place, and what is it that is kind of impeding them from just leaving an unsafe situation. But I also wanted to say about this, maybe until readers like stop seeing kind of these stories as exotic and just more as see the universality in these stories, then I think that will bring, that maybe we'll start to get more formal questions about
More craft questions.
More craft questions. Yes, absolutely. I wonder whether you would each read us just a snippet, a paragraph, a page, so we can hear the voices of the books. And so we've been talking so much about the style and all the exquisite things happening on the sentence level, if we can just get a taste.
Sure.
And then we'll keep talking.
I'm going to read from the first page. Okay, so this is from Chula's point of view. So she's the one that is able to come to the U.S. The photograph. She sits in a plastic chair in front of a brick wall, slouching. She is meek with her hair parted down the middle. There are almost no lips to be seen, but by the way she bares her teeth, you can tell she is smiling. At first, this smile seems flat, but the more I study it, the more it seems careless and irresponsible. There is a bundle in her arms and a hole for the newborn's face, which comes out red and wrinkled like an old person's. I know it's a boy because of the blue ribbon woven into the blanket edge. Then I stare at the man behind Petrona. He is afroed and striking, weighing his cursed hand on her shoulder. I know what he's done. And it turns my stomach, but who am I to say whom Petrona should allow into a family portrait such as this? On the back, there's a date stamp of when the photo was printed. And because when I count back 9 months, it falls exactly in the month my family and I fled from Colombia and arrived in LA, I turn back the photograph to look intently at the baby, to register every wrinkle and bulge around the dark hole of his gaping mouth, to decide whether he is crying or laughing, because I know exactly where and how he was conceived. And that's how I lose track of time, thinking it was my fault that the girl Petrona was just 15 when her belly was filled with bones. And when Mama comes back from work, she does not yell, even though she sees the photograph, the envelope, the letter from Petrona, all addressed to me. No, Mama sits down next to me like taking off so much weight, and together we are quiet and sorry on our dirty stoop on Via Corona in East LA, staring at that fucking photograph.
Thank you. I don't know what I'm going to read. You guys can help me. I was going to read, I was thinking of reading something from the first page, but then I was also thinking of reading something that I've never read before that has more dialogue in it, if I can find it. I mean, it might be first page just because of, so what are we thinking, dialogue or first page?
The dialogue
This is a choose your own adventure.
Ted did kind of put out that teaser about the amazing first opening paragraph.
Oh, that's right. Oh,
But that's also a
right.
teaser people could follow up on that.
Look forward to being disappointed. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Ted, this is on you. So you're a girl and you're poor, but at least you're light-skinned. That'll save you. You're the second eldest child and the second eldest daughter of a family of 6 children, and your parents are subsistence farmers. Your mom sells vegetables at the local market, and when that doesn't make enough food to put food on the table, you sell fruit and beans by the side of the road. That is, until your father manages to get a job working as a clerk for the American military in Guam, where he acquires a mistress and regularly sends money back to the family, the latter gesture absolving the first. He returns every 3 years for a visit, which is why you and nearly all your siblings are 3, 6, or 9 years apart in age. On those rare visits, you treat him with rudeness out of loyalty to your mother, who neither thanks nor acknowledges your efforts, or, for that matter, your existence. Eczema-ridden you at 8, hungry adolescent you at 12, all your early, ragged versions. When you're old enough to know better, but not old enough to actually stop talking back to him, your father will remind you, usually by throwing a chair at your head, that the only reason you're able to attend nursing school is because of his army dollars. It's your first introduction to debt, to utang na loob, the long, drawn-out torch song of filial loyalty. But when it comes to genres, you prefer a heist. Take the money and run. Growing up, everyone says you're stupid, you're clumsy, you get into at least one fight a week, and even your light skin, while universally covetable, is suspicious. Your father often accuses your mother of having taken up with a Chinese merchant or Japanese soldier or Tisoy businessman while he was away. Did that happen? You don't know. Is that unknown man your father? You don't know. If it happened, was it your mother's choice? Was it an affair? Or was it a case of a word you won't say, can't think, a word that drifts like smog through your life and the lives of all the women around you? You don't know. Looking at your own face doesn't tell you. There isn't anyone you can ask. When you're hungry, sometimes you go out into the fields and stick your stumpy arm down the pockmarks in the earth where tiny dakumo crabs like to scurry away and hide, your fingers grasping for the serrated edge of the shell. Some days you collect enough to carry home for your mother to steam, using the lower half of your shirt as a basket, but sometimes you can't wait, yanking one out by the leg and dashing it on the ground to stun it, then eating the whole thing right there, live and raw, spitting out bits of calcium. Sometimes instead of a crab, you pull out a wiggling frog, but most of the time you throw those away. Watch them hop to safety. On good days, on the days when there are no crabs, no frogs, not even a weak snake, you go around picking dica grass, the kind that farmers usually feed their horses. You sell makeshift bundles of them by the side of the road alongside the mangos and the chico. On good days, the dica grass sells so well you produce a little side economy that gives you enough money to buy some chocolate, maybe the latest issue of Hibaga so you can catch up on your comics, even though at the end of every one you have to read the most hateful words you'll ever encounter in any language. Abangan ang susunod na kabanata. Look out for the next chapter.
Both so stunning, and you both read openings, which of course have the pressure of like holding the DNA of the book, as well as like pulling the reader in, and just even thinking on craft level. Opening with a photograph for you, Ingrid. We have this character who is already away from Colombia, and look at the photograph of the person who stayed. So by having these people with this enormous geographic distance, you create an intimacy because she's looking at a picture of her, and yet you simultaneously establish that sense of distance because it's the photograph and the person herself is now unreachable. So it's that form mirrors content, right? You're like building all of that in with just this very simple image, and then of course putting in all these hooks of narrative tension. Well, what is it that this person has done, and how did her belly fill with bones, and what is the story, right? So plunging us right in, and then with you, Elaine, the use of the second person, right? The you address, right? Just it has an immediacy to it that is so complete that the reader is just like forced directly into the consciousness of a person whose life experience they may not share, but it's like really deep, right? And then you have that metaphor about the what surrounds women like fog, like that image for sexual assault. Is this like the strongest metaphors are not only beautiful but also precise, right? And the precision of that is just right in there. Wouldn't you agree? So on craft, another question about craft. As you were writing, What are some of the books that accompanied you? What are some of the books that inspired you? What were you reading either before working on the book or while writing on the book that sparked things for you, that opened things up? How did you meld your reading life with your writing life?
I think for me, I would say the book that inspired me the most was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. I was so thrilled when I read this book, and I think when I read it, I was maybe just a little bit into the novel. I didn't have a full draft yet, but I remember reading it and just being so moved by how political it was, how much kind of like historical things there were in the book, and how it was that, like the kind of the violence of war, the violence of kind of like an unsettled country paired with the innocence of two siblings going through it together. It thrilled me so much. And in a way that I remember like reaching the end of the very end of the book and then just like turning to the first page again. Like it was that kind of book for me. I was also reading The Old Order by Catherine Ann Porter. And what else was that? I was reading so much. But I think when I was really working on the book, I stayed away from many novels, and I was reading instead a lot of nonfiction. But yeah, those are some of the, I think, most important influences.
I mean, I think the book that I probably read, I mean, I read it and reread it constantly, and I'm sure I was reading it, and it is Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy. I don't know if people have read that.
Yes.
I feel like that book, I mean, I would love to have written a spare novella in that way. I mean, I feel like that's still the kind of lighthouse for me. Obviously, I failed completely.
On the slimness.
Yeah,
Only on the slimness did you fail.
But I mean, I think that book, I don't even remember now when I read it or when I started reading Jamaica Kincaid's work, but all of her work, Lucy, Annie John, an autobiography of my mother is a killer.
Yes. At the bottom of the river, and just all of them, everything.
But Lucy in particular, I think, is one of those that struck a chord because, I mean, even, especially, I think reading it now, I think I always am so just stunned by her prose, how she works formally. It's a very spare novella, the kind of precision, the lucidity of her language, and then also how sort of prescient and funny and sharp and desperately sad also, that book, and angry. I think Jamaica Kincaid is often called angry in a way that is very loaded, obviously, for obvious reasons. And but there is, I think, an unapologetic anger in that book, in a way that I think for me it was incredibly refreshing, sort of, I think, in a way bracing and I think enervating to see, because it's a book that, I mean, you know, I think, when was it written? Something like 90, I think it was like late 80s, early 90s, and it's still like, it's incredibly sort of present about, for example, like it's the relationship between this sort of West Indian au pair and her white employer. It brings out sort of so many sort of scenes that are still delicious about sort of like white feminism and sort of, you know, like, I mean, I think, you know, the current sort of like that Elizabeth Warren thing about like, you know, she thinking that she's like part native, that also occurs in Lucy. There are all of these sort of incredible sort of moments that for me, and I think with every year that I read it, like it almost becomes more and more alive to me. And I think in particular, it's just a great, I think one of our best books about female freedom, ultimately. I think it's one of our really, about a woman, and who is also a woman of color, who's also an immigrant, trying to make herself as a person, what that constitutes, you know, like finding people to like fuck, to fall in love with, not really, to, you know, have a relationship with your mother, sort of. You know, the kind of sort of that sort of staggering towards what it is to, you know, make a life. And I think for that, I always return to that book again and again.
Yeah. And part of what you're saying too is the rereading, right? Once you have a relationship like that with a book, returning every time brings something as writers.
Yeah,
right.
for sure.
Yeah. So part of this series is rising writers, California writers. We're here in the Bay Area and very much in this very rich literary space and community, despite what it appears some people seem to be saying, right? Is there anything you can say about what it means to you to be a Bay Area writer? Or, you know, like a California writer if you want, but I'm thinking about like a Bay Area writer in terms of community and working on your book here or living here while launching your book, like just being part of the texture of this place, culturally, geographically, just kind of wherever you want to take it.
I think we've had such an amazing year. Like I love, you know, our year. There were so many amazing Bay Area books. Lydia Kiesling, who's I think the coming. She's going to be here doing a talk. Aro Kwan, Tommy Orange. There was just like so many amazing books. But prior to that moment, I remember kind of like writing the book and just feeling like I could barely figure out how to stay here.
Yeah.
Like there was a lot of effort into, you know, how do I figure out housing and how does that all work out? But it feels so that's the reality of being a Bay Area writer, and just the tension of trying to lead and have an artistic life here when that is maybe not supported by the city as much, and you know that paired with kind of the richness that we do have as a community.
Yeah. So there's a tension between that very real cultural vitality and the financial reality.
And we've also lost so many people through the years.
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing the book, I wasn't living in the Bay Area. I had been out of the Bay Area for about 8.5 years. I was living in London or in England for a long time. And just came back. I came back a month before the book launched, which was, I mean, it was a lot was happening in that springtime. So coming back to the Bay Area after being away for so long, coming back to sort of my family and community, and also coming back to a Bay Area that had changed profoundly. And I'd been back a couple times. I hadn't been back loads because plane tickets, but it was an entirely different experience being, like I lived in Milpitas, the town I grew up in and the town, you know, where the majority of the book takes place. And Milpitas is a town I would have never thought would be, in a way, gentrified. I was just like, it's always a kind of, you know, ultimately like Filipino, Mexican, Vietnamese town that I was like, you know, there's no way like Milpitas is ever going to be cool. Like there's a giant landfill. It always smells like shit. Like no one wants to live here. Like it's not a desirable place to live. And yet when I came back and sort of was like, oh well, like let's look at like if I didn't just spend, you know, like live in perpetuity with my mom, which obviously she would love. You know, what would like rent be like here? And I was like, what happened to Milpitas? So that, I think, was certainly a shock. But I think, you know, I do feel very much a Bay Area writer. I felt a Bay Area writer even when I was living outside of the Bay Area. I feel very much a South Bay Area writer as well. I feel, there really are sort of, I think, I do feel sort of regional differences. I mean, you know, I grew up in a town, like, we didn't have a bookstore. You know, we didn't have indie bookstores or chain bookstores. I think we got a Borders maybe when I was like late in high school. But growing up, it was like library or Goodwill. So there also wasn't a huge sort of widespread kind of reading or literary culture. And yet I did feel like I grew up around a lot of people who were artistic in temperament or were artistic in loads of ways, in ways that maybe the practicalities of their lives didn't allow them to then sort of play out. But I think for me, I think that's probably the kind of, the way I sort of think about the Bay Area is also thinking about the kind of Bay Areas that we don't see. You know, my dad worked as a security guard for like a computer chip company, you know, so that's the tech Bay Area. And we see a lot of, that's a Bay Area that we see a lot of. We don't see a lot of, you know, the people who are, you know, technicians working on the technician floor or the manufacturing floor for those companies or, you know, working, the nurses. My mom was a nurse, like many Filipino women are nurses. You know, this sort of class of people in the Bay Area, I think we get less shine on. So I think that's my Bay Area, at least.
And so bringing that to center and plumbing consciousness through fiction of such characters is a really powerful
I think assuming that it's center. I think I was spoiled by the fact that I grew up in a town like Milpitas. I was never a minority in Milpitas. It was always a majority minority town. Like it was always, like I think something now is like 60-something% sort of non-white town, and sort of like I think there was maybe one white kid in our class. So I never had the sense that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, but I never had the sense that like what I grew up with was not normal. That what I grew up with was not American. So I think it was only at some point in middle school where my parents were like, we're gonna be aspirational middle class. You're going to this Catholic school. And then I was like, oh, like, and even that school in the peninsula, I think it was maybe like half white. So that, you know, by standards now, we would say that that school is super diverse. But I remember thinking, I was like, there's loads of white people, what? I've never been surrounded, like it was my first encounter with white people, I think, ever. So I think but what that allowed me is not having a kind of knee-jerk sense that I have to pander for an audience that I think that I've been taught to assume is universal, because that audience is not the universal audience to me. The audience that I think of is the audience like the one that I grew up in, and I would love for more American fiction to sound like that, like it doesn't assume that particular audience.
Yeah. Absolutely. So moving to questions from the audience. We're ready. Thank you so much to you both for all of those amazing thoughts, and we are continuing the conversation with questions from the audience. So who would like to launch? There's a mic, I think.
Microphone is here.
Maybe wave and we will give you the mic.
I think I want to ask.
Passive voice. The mic shall be given to you.
Thanks to both of you for coming and just sharing your two novels. So question to you, Elaine, actually. I'm curious about two things. The first, I already forgot. So let's go ahead and start with the second question, which is, what role did you have in terms of deciding the title that corresponds slightly with Carlos Bolasan's novel?
Yeah. I mean, initially, the story I always tell is that initially it just started out as a joke, which is, I mean, it is a reference to Carlos Bolasan's America is in the Heart, a kind of seminal, Filipino text about sort of the experience of largely Filipino and Mexican laborers in the West Coast in the 1930s. And I think whenever I heard America is in the Heart, I would always just hear like, America isn't the heart, especially if it was spoken in a Filipino accent. So I think it was always a joke to myself. I was like, I'll have a short story one day that'll be called that. And that is why the last chapter still has the conjunction. So I think it started out as a joke, but ultimately it is a conversation, in some way an argument against that book. It's a book that means the world to me. It's also the first book that I ever saw rural, like poor Filipinos from Pangasinan, in. My mom is from Pangasinan. I never, the descriptions that Bulasan has about, his mom, or the kind of, the market, selling sort of beans at market and being looked down on by upper class Filipinos, that story could have come out of my grandma's mouth. And I'd never seen that, in fiction. So the shock of recognition was very alive for me there. But, there's also, I think, a huge sort of sense of misogyny in that book that is less sort of critiqued and needs to be sort of engaged with when we talk about his legacy. I mean, I don't know if you know, but the America's in the Heart is coming out and is being reissued by Penguin Classics in the spring, and I was lucky enough to write the foreword for it. And
awesome.
so that's
great.
I was, if you get the chance to,
So you checked Carlos Bolasan through the grave.
I checked him through the grave.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I was like, listen.
I mean, talk about writers in conversation.
Actually-
Right? It's very easy to drag someone who's dead. So
Yeah.
So both writers, I finally remembered what my first question was, which is the term immigrant fiction. What role did the two of you have in terms of using that term? Because I've never heard it before.
I don't think too much about what the terms are put around the novel. I know some writers are very sensitive about it, like they don't want to be called a feminist writer, like a woman writer, a Colombian writer. I don't mind any of those because I feel like I am those things. Like I am feminist, Colombian, now Colombian American, immigrant writer. Like I, just put all those labels and then just say novel, and then and I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. I don't feel that sort of anxiety at all about like, don't pigeonhole me. I mean, ultimately that anxiety comes out of what we were talking about, this sort of desire to be part of the kind of neutral, universal discourse and be valorized as that. But I don't think it's in any way a downgrade or in any way apart from literature to be like, yes, it's a novel that's about immigrants and queer people and women. And so I think, I'm very happy to be part of that rich tradition that's part of American. If anything, I don't think we need to be calling fewer novels immigrant novels. We need to be calling more novels like middle class novels or like white people novels. Like we need to actually, incorporate that into our discourse.
I have a quick question for both of you. Will your novels be translated into your native languages for the native speaking population here, or for the Spanish-speaking or Filipino audiences? Abroad.
Actually, my novel has been translated for both. So it was, the book came out and then it was translated for a Spanish-speaking audience in the US. And then it's just been, there's a Spanish publisher that bought the novel and they did their own translation for Spain and South America, and we did edits together for that audience specifically, and it was very interesting. The translation, well, like when I said I was writing the book and I was doing like a translation in my head. So in a sense, I always think of this novel as a translation, like the original one that I wrote. I feel that is a translation. So for me to read the translation of the translation was a little bit of a mind fuck, and then to read the translation of the translation of the translation. So that was a lot, but it is interesting to see how the language changes slightly depending on where the book is going and what the background might be that people have that they're coming. What their language is and how they need to be met in the book.
Well, thanks to the U.S. colonization of the Philippines, the second language in the Philippines is English. So a lot of people do. The book is published in the Philippines, and people have read it and I was there for a literary festival last April, which was incredible. There's a really just incredibly radical and vibrant literary community over there, and so the book exists there, and it exists in English. It likely won't be translated into Tagalog or Pangasinan or Ilocano. Although there is a really interesting resurgence and movement there to have more books be in Filipino languages, in regional Filipino languages from all over, which is super interesting because then I got to meet sort of really amazing writers that are really fighting to have language, their books published in their languages and not necessarily in English or even in Tagalog or in Filipino. So that it exists in English in the Philippines, and it's in translation. It's in translation in multiple countries now also, which is very surreal.
I thank you. What an amazing evening, so inspiring. I teach people at San Francisco State to be writers, and you're so inspiring to discover voice in all languages and all emotions. I have a question about your craft. I was a lit major in college, and it wasn't until my senior year that I discovered people like Jessica Hagedorn existed, and it blew my mind. And I remember trying to have a conversation with my parents about dog eaters, And they said, who would want to say that in public? Who would want to reveal parts of the ugly history? And so I have a question about bringing your craft to very intimate places, such as family gatherings, where you're either asked questions, innuendo, wondering, even though you can, at some level, it is not autobiographical, but the burden of feeling that it might be. And how you manage that. I just know from my own family, being one of 12 families, having grown up in southern Delaware, where you tried to be as invisible as possible, we didn't call attention to some of the parts of our history, and it wasn't ever a question practice. So now, I just wonder, now that at the public face of being a writer, how do you manage that? And I'd love to hear from both of you because of the political histories in both countries.
I just forgot what I was going to say.
Well, my book, I did base the characters in the book on people in my family, and I did tell them very early on that I was doing that, and they're all just such outgoing people. My sister's a Scorpio, my mom is a Leo. So they immediately thought that they were the main character in the book. And so then, but I think it was the way to do it, because then I kept calling them and I would say, like, guess what your character is doing now? And so I kind of kept them updated on the things that I was putting their fictional counterpart through. And yeah, so I feel like I took them along the ride of, what happens when you base something on someone and then it becomes something else entirely. So I think that they were with me on that. And by the time that the book came out, there were no surprises. Like my mother knew that her fictional counterpart had an affair and she wasn't a great mother. Like, she just knew all of these things. And she got, like, they all got very excited about it. Like, they started to have ideas of their own. They're like, what if, what if you do this? Like, what if my character does this instead? So it was fun. It was fun to, like, bring them along. And I felt like to them, maybe it's like the language of like soap opera. Like, that's what I think we're referencing. And they're like, no, like, have her slap him in the face, and then, there'll be a twin that comes out. That's the kind of ideas that they were bringing.
I love that. I mean, to some extent, my mom was the exact same. My mom was like, "Oh, this book is definitely about me, right?" And I was like, and then it's like, bisexual communist, who's that? So there was a surprise. I mean, I definitely did also. I was in a WhatsApp chat with my mom for a lot of it, asking sort of in the 70s, what did you eat on the street? And things like that. I was definitely involved, and there are characters in the book that are sort of loosely based on people in my life. But I think a lot of it is also, especially if you don't have access, in a way it's a little related to something like historical research. If a lot of the things that you're writing about aren't in a lot of books, or aren't in a lot of libraries, or the details of it haven't been archived because of the politics of the archive, then it does mean you have to be creative about how to sort of essentially populate your world. There are not that many Pangasinan English dictionaries, so I had to ask people who spoke Pangasinan, or I had to go on forums where Pangasinan speakers were talking and gossiping to each other, and have to sort of read it aloud to myself so I could hear it and go, oh yeah, that's what they're talking about. So I think in that way, that's how I essentially had to involve sort of people in my family to help out with, and then, my family / my mom's coworkers. Because if I would talk to because I was in London, I would text my mom, and then my mom, if she didn't know an answer, she would ask all her coworkers, who are also all obviously Filipino. So they all were also being like, no, that's not the song we listened to in the 70s. This is the song we listened to in the 70s. So there was also that sense of like community kind of involvement and possession in those aspects, which then ultimately ended up not being that huge in the book. But I think, my family's not hugely literate, so I think it's more the sense of, an enormous sense of, pride that there's that the book exists. I think there's an incredible love for it, and then I think also kind of respectful, but you do your thing, and,
Yeah.
and to be, and I'm good with that, I think.
Question here.
Hi. So thanks for sharing your story and experience. I think both of your stories, personally, I haven't read either of your books, but I will definitely will be taking a closer look at that. What you're talking about evokes a lot of emotion and evokes a lot of heavy material, I think. And I think the topic that comes up is a mixture of, white people, or why aren't there more voices like ours or mine being shared out there? And there are reasons for that. Starting with a comment I might have is basically when we think about Filipino people, I'm not from the Bay Area, but I'm from a place where there are a lot of Colombians, and we built major cities. We built the places that we're talking about seeking more inclusion and diversity in. And as a reminder to why it's so important to say, white people, and to have to say that, I think it's important to have that context of hey, we built this. We helped build all of this, and we played a big role. So the question that I have is that, I see that you have, certain academic backgrounds, but how can we encourage people who might not have that same structured academic background to want to share their stories? I think the last question evoked some of what I'm thinking as far as people not wanting to share their stories, or people getting into, you mentioned your father being in a different place. I can't imagine my parents having being in a position to get published in the 70s, right? So how today, 2020, 2019, 2025, how do we encourage our story to be shared and heard more? And yeah.
I was a kid of local libraries. Local libraries really saved me, I think, and showed me that there was fiction that included people like me in it, and not just people like me, but included, how I found Jamaica Kincaid, how I found Jessica Hagedorn. You mentioned Jessica Hagedorn and Carlos Bulosa and things like that. So I do think protecting civic spaces like our local libraries is one of the first sort of steps, ultimately, because local libraries are also the places where people who, as you said, don't have access to academic institutions, who don't have access to independent bookstores, or can't afford, the prices of sort of full price books at independent bookstores, even used bookstores.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm also just thinking in terms of people, your contemporaries that might have other professional backgrounds. And there's so many stories. When you talk about Filipinos, you're talking about millions of people every year that leave the Philippines. That's a million stories, right? So how do we encourage people to I guess, sorry, when I say, I don't know what my question is, but
I'll answer it for you.
Sure.
We're starting this new series called Rising Writers Series, and this is the forum for what exactly you're talking about. Do you want to respond as well, Ingrid?
Yeah, Ingrid, do you want to jump in?
Too many stories.
To this?
Yeah, I do think a lot about how to encourage young people to tell the stories, and I am working right now. I got a grant from the city to go into a public high school, and I work with immigrant high school students, and I go in for 6 hours a week and get them to do creative writing. And I think also as an author, I've also visited high schools, like done readings and visited high schools, and that feels like even just, people of color seeing another person of color with a book, like is something that does a lot of work, I think, because it's that image of, oh, there's people like me doing this, and you don't always know that when you're young and you have so many things to worry about, and maybe there's stuff going on at home, and you have maybe immigration things to worry about. You're not thinking like, how can I tell my story? Like that's not what is on your mind. But I think it is something about exposure. Like it is, young people seeing that other people doing it like them, and it is seeing those books in libraries and figuring where they are and having someone like be like, read this. Like I think you'll like this. I think that it's all part of that. Is all the work that I think we need to do more of.
Great. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Ingrid Rojas Contreras and Elaine Castillo and our moderator, Carolina de Robertis, for an inspiring and insightful evening. And also encourage you all to come back for our next program with Daniel Gumbener, which is on April 18th. And we will continue to share our diverse voices, and also want to thank Ted Gioia for co-curating this incredible series, and we hope to see all of you back in a month. Flyers are out at the front, and please join us. There's a little more wine and refreshments, and come meet our authors and buy a book and enjoy. Thank you.